I'm going to finish off soil erosion because I want to start on soil quality. And today we're going to be sort of talking about some of the, when we get into soil quality, we're going to be talking about some of the things that we as a planet are going to be facing. But let's finish off on soil gravity, and then we'll transition into soil gravity, into to erosion, gravity erosion, and then we'll transition into soil quality. So this is where I was basically, I ended on last Monday. And so we've been talking about wind erosion and water erosion. The last of the large erosion components is gravity. And it's basically the mass movement of material due to the forces of gravity. When we see really rapid ones, this is what we call landslide. But generally, most of us are seeing, actually most of us don't even pay attention to this, but most of us experiencing this all the time. And this is basically soil creep, where it's slow and constant. Slowly things move down slope, okay? It's usually assisted by water because of issues of friction. The water basically decreases the holding capacity of friction. And so as a result, with the increased weight of the water in the soil, you have increased weight, less friction, and you'll have slides, okay? It's favored by steep slopes as well as layered soils, soils that have high water capacity versus and are slowly draining versus soils that have low water capacity and are quickly draining. A good example of this, most of you have probably driven from here up to Syracuse, and you go up into the dry. We've talked about the dry Finger Lake that's up there, where the valley gets really steep. Okay, it was at one period of time a big lake. And you can imagine as a lake, as you see around here, different soil textures are going to be laid at different locations. So if here's the lake, if you're looking up the soil valley, okay, here's the lake, and the lake starts up here, there's going to be a lot of wave action up here. So as a result, you're potentially going to be getting sandier soils along these edges. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. But depending upon where in the lake you are or the activity at that lake, what you're going to see is you're going to see layers of materials up here. You're going to have sand lenses covered up by clay lenses, and then another sand lens, and then clay lenses. And it's all due to really this angle of the slope of the lake and the edge of the lake. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah? Okay. Sooner or later, the lake is going to disappear. And what's going to happen is you're going to have these slopes at the edges that are going to be literally layers of sand with coatings of clay over them. And then another layer of sand and a coating of clay. And these are the banks of our Finger Lakes. Okay? Now what's going to happen when it starts raining? Well, the water is going to come in, it's going to infiltrate, and it's going to preferentially go down all of these. Okay? And what's going to happen is these sand lenses are going to build up a lot of water in them. And if there's a clay lens on top of it, this clay lens is basically going to seal that sand lens, right? And so in essence, if I punctured this right here, the clay lens, I'd have an artesian effect. Makes sense? Okay. Well, what's going to happen if I don't puncture that? Okay. I have this sand lens that's sort of pushing up against the clay, and then the clay also gets saturated. So the clay is heavier, and there's less friction with the sand lens below because the water is sort of pushing it up. What's going to happen? You're going to have a catastrophic flow. Okay? Now, when you guys go up to Syracuse next time, take a look for the Tully exit. Okay? And when you come up to the Tully exit, what you're going to do is you're going to be starting to go uphill. Okay? Look across the valley onto the other side, and you can see the side of the hills. And this has happened a lot of times, but about 10, maybe 15 years ago, probably longer than that, there was a really catastrophic slide where the entire hillside just basically slid off. Okay, and it took out a house, and it also buried a car. A guy saw this slide coming, and he got into his van and basically drove as fast as he could, but the slide just basically buried the van, and he's ending up standing on top of the van waiting for rescue. It was this type of an event. It's sort of like a mini Lahar type of an event. Okay, but this was due to a number of factors. Part of it was management, where up here we were all farming, okay, and we'd cut the tops so water was going down, okay. The history of the Finger Lake, and then it was a period of time that we had had a lot of rain for weeks and weeks and weeks. That was just the ideal situation for this to happen. I did put this little component in here as well. This is, if you think about this sort of Lahar type of effect or this slide type of effect, anything that's going to sort of either puncture or stabilize that boundary is going to hold the soil more in place. Okay? Now, and it doesn't have to be this specific type of a scenario where you're looking at laminar lenses of different soil material. Okay? If I have anything that is going to stabilize the soil, like roots, or reduce the amount of water that's moving into the system, i.e. evapotranspiration, I'm going to reduce the amount of erosion, or gravity erosion, or landslides. Does that make sense? Let's skip this. The last section of this erosion lecture was really about physical degradation. You know, when we're talking about erosion, we're often talking about just the material moving, but there are incipient conditions and management things that we do that actually encourage or discourage this erosion. 3 methods of basically reducing compaction. Okay, compaction would if I compact a soil, what am I going to be doing to infiltration rates? I'm going to be reducing it. Okay, so if I want to reduce the amount of overland flow of water, I want to increase infiltration. So let's think about compaction. I put less mechanical weight on top. Okay, get the machines off the top. Okay, I reduce the number of traveling trips across, whether it's a machine or it's a person or anything like that. The classic example here is the desire lines that are out in the ag quad. Okay, and also I keep off the soil when it's wet. Why would I want to keep off the soil when it's wet? The same reason why erosion, gravity erosion, is increased when it is wet, when soils are wet. Why? Wetness reduces the amount of friction, which makes it easier to compact. Make sense? Okay. We can reverse compaction, but in many cases the reversal process basically actually really moves the compaction. Certainly when you have surface compaction, you go in there with deep tillage or something like that and break up the surface, but often with that type of operation, you're actually increasing compaction down below, deeper down. Okay, this is the sort of the plow layer type of effect. Crusting can also be reduced by, in fact, plowing. We can, in fact, go in there and break it up, but if we put in too much plowing, we're in essence going to be moving that compaction farther down. Okay, adding some sort of flocculant, something to break things up, and then also mulches. Mulches do this in a number of different ways. Certainly, if I put a mulch on, we're going to reduce the amount of rainfall that's going to be pounding on top of the soil and reducing the breaking up of the aggregates. But also, if I put mulches in there, I'm also encouraging more moisture in the system, more biological activity, and as a result, I'll have more aggregate stability or aggregate curation and ultimately aggregate stability. And I think that's the end of this. So let's try to switch over. Back to Fred. Okay, so what I'm going to do for the rest of the week, I'm going to sort of change up a little bit, and we're still going to be doing sort of the lecture format. But what I'd like to do is we're going to talk about soil quality. And when I talk about soil quality is one of those terms. It's like water quality. What does water quality mean to you guys? What is water? When I say water quality, what do you think? Degree of purification. Anything else? How usable it is. Very related to the purification. Any other thoughts about water quality? What? Pathogens. You know, so some sort of measurement of usability, maybe. I mean, would that be a fair sort of? Oh. You guys don't have to read this one. This is meant to sort of transition us into sort of thinking about where we're going to be going in the future. But I'm going to be talking about soil quality versus water quality. But they're very comparable. If we think about water quality, we think of it sort of as a measure for usability. Okay? We'll think about that the same way you think of soil quality. Okay? What is soil quality? I mean, has anybody ever heard of soil quality before? If I threw that term out at you, what would you think of soil quality? What do you think soil quality is? People often have a little bit different interpretation of soil quality versus water quality. Okay, but in essence, they're really meaning the same thing. Water quality is sort of a measurement of its usability. Well, soil quality is also a measurement of its usability. The difference with water quality versus soil quality is that we generally use soils for a lot of different purposes. Okay? When it comes to water, we don't necessarily use it for a lot of different purposes that have different characteristics. We need to have a certain amount of cleanliness or whatever it is for it to be used, whether we're using it for drinking water, for irrigation, for industrial uses, for waste management. Okay? Those are what we use water for. Well, we use soil for a lot more different purposes. Okay? So, let's think about issues that we are going to be facing, and I'm premising this under soil quality, but for today, we're basically going to be talking about what are we going to be facing in the world. Okay? So let's sort of set the stage. Okay? And we're going to put this under two rubrics. One is the soil quality rubric, but the other one is food. Okay? So setting the stage, let's talk about population. Okay? World population, this is 1950 to 2050. The blue line represents population increase. The arrow is indicating about where we are. I guess maybe more 2013, but population almost 7 billion people in the world, right? Am I wrong? About 7 billion? Yeah. Last year, so the line's wrong, not me. So we're about 7 billion people. Okay? Now, if we think about where those people are, though, there's a big distribution change across the planet. Okay? Let's take a look at this one right here. Down at the bottom, we're basically looking at the developed parts of the world. Pretty flat line starting about the last decade. Okay? Right here, this is Latin America. Coming up into China, a fairly large boost here. The one-child policy. India, fairly large boost as well. Other Asian countries, huge boost. And then Africa. So the big part of the increases are really India, other Asia, and Africa. Okay? Now, if we think about where these people are living, not just regionally, but sort of in relationship to density of population and things like that, you're really looking at urban versus rural. Okay? These greener, darker lines down here, these are the more developed world. You're basically looking at an increase in the urban population starting probably around in the 1950s, 1960s. Okay, where the vast majority in the developing world of the population were in urban environments. Okay, so I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when you looked at the world population, 50% of the world population at that point were now living in urban environments. Okay, in the developed world, that was a long time ago. Okay, so if we look at something right around here, you're splitting urban, rural. Right around here is when 50% split happened. Okay. Now the interesting thing here to look at is if we look at the low-income countries versus the high-income countries, that split is the same as in the high-income countries, but look at the amount of population. Okay, so that's setting the stage one. Setting the stage two, we already set. We talked about this, I guess, a week and a half ago, but we're looking at soil degradation. Natural resources, if soils and landscapes are where we're going to be producing our food and where people are living, now granted we do harvest a lot of food from the oceans, but there's not a lot of people living in the oceans. Okay, we're looking at sort of landscape degradation here. Okay, we've already talked about this one, so we'll skip over this one. Okay, the next thing to consider, if we're talking about food, where is the food being produced? Okay? Now, these are basically, and if most of the food is being produced on land, and it is, food, fiber, and fuel is mostly on land, where does that land, where are we counting that land? These are the climatic zones here, so we have polar, subpolar, cold temperate, cool temperate, warm temperate, and tropical. Okay, this line here basically tells you of the millions of hectares that are out there, how much of that is arable. Okay, and then of that arable, what's grazing, what's non-arable. Okay, so potentially arable. When we say arable, we're really meaning sort of under the plow type of stuff. Okay, so crop production. Okay, then grazing, you really can't put the plow in. You can't do crop production, but you can have animal operations. And then non-arable basically means nothing. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, and if you look at the climatic zones, it totally makes sense. I mean, the cold regions, you're really not looking at a lot of arable activity. When you get down to the tropical regions, you know, the total land area is basically, almost all of it is really arable in some sense or another. Okay, now the interesting thing here is that it should be noted that we're also looking at this difference between what you would think of as sort of food coming from plant material versus food coming from animal material. And as you move farther and farther south, you see an increase in that, or a decrease, I should say, a decrease in the grazing percentage of the total. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so there's a good chunk of this world that we can have agricultural operations, but we can't be growing tomatoes everywhere. And that's often a hard message for people to take. The thought is, well, if we took all of the land that is arable and put it into vegetable production, we'd be able to meet, you know, all the nutritional needs of everything and everybody and so on. But the reality is that a good chunk of the planet, we can't grow tomatoes. So you have to think about what type of crops that you can grow, and if you can in fact grow crops, or you have to go to some alternate form of agriculture production, which is primarily animal production. All right, so we've got three things to think about. First is we've got population pressure. Second is we have land issues. And third is we have specific locations in the planet that we can only grow certain things. All right, so let's talk about what's happened, and then we'll start talking about what potentially we can do. Okay, so this is basically an increase, basically looking from the early 1960s to the early 1990s. This is dated material. Okay, but if we look at regions and we look at the increase of food. Okay, so if we go back, I haven't showed this slide yet, and I'm going to hold off on this. But think about this. If we are going to increase production, food production, there are basically only two ways we can do that. What are those two? I mean, the answers are right there. What are the two ways that we can do that? First way is we can literally increase the amount of area that we're farming. Okay? The other way is we can increase the amount of food that we are growing on every square foot. Okay? So we can increase the area or we can increase the yield. This slide basically represents the increase of food that is attributed to each one of these areas. Okay? So if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, 47% of the increase in food is basically attributed to an increased area. They're increasing their growing area. 52% of it is attributed to an increase in the production of that area. Does that make sense? Okay. The interesting thing to see here is basically look at this half versus this half. And South Asia is sort of in the middle. But down here, East Asia, the high-income countries, huge chunk is due to increased yield. Now, this is partially reflected by the Green Revolution. actually partially, is majorly reflected by the Green Revolution, increased use of fertilizers, okay? The numbers that you're seeing up here, still the vast majority is due to increased yield. But a good chunk of it is also this increased area. Okay, so we got population, you got land degradation, and we have this issue of where or what you're growing. So this chart right here is basically looking at India. Okay, this is the entire world, but this is India. If we take a look at this, if we're looking at this component here, increased area versus increased yield. If India had not had increased yield from 1960 to basically 1993, this line right here represents how much land they would have used or would have had to use if they had not increased yield per hectare. This line here represents the amount of land used to grow the food that they are today. All right? Very interesting juxtaposition if you think about this issue of I only have two options to increase my yield. One is I increase my acreage. Two is I increase my yield. India is a very good example. Now, at the same time as we've seen this, up until the mid-90s, now this has changed since then, the yield has increased and the price has dropped. Now, we could argue this. Now, we know something that when this chart was made, they didn't know. We know what's happened since then. Okay? But an argument could be made that the main beneficiaries, and I say it right here, the main beneficiaries of this price drop is basically the people who put more of their money into food. Okay? If you look at the entire amount of money that you have and the percentage of it that you put into food, who are going to benefit the most from the price drop? Now, this is the argument. Who do you think? The people who have less disposable income. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, what has happened? Actually, it lasted. This kept going down for about here. But what's happened around here? Has anybody been keeping around 2005 and 6? We had a couple of prices doing this. Okay. Now, there's been a lot of arguments as to why that's happened, but yields have continued to increase, but they haven't been as dramatic as this. But prices are starting to do this. They're not coming down as they were. Okay. So something to think about. Other things to think about. The majority of agricultural development in developing nations is based on traditional agricultural practices. And these traditional agricultural practices were very, very successful. The problem with these agricultural practices is that we're starting to see things like this. Now, look at this. This is the fertility level of the soil, and this is the years of cultivation. Okay? These years, these light green years, are basically cultivated years. These dark green years are basically the years where it's fallow. Okay? And traditional practices, you leave the field fallow. For, in this case, they're looking at 7 or 8 years here, and then you harvest for a couple years, and then you let it go fallow again, let the soil fertility come back up. Okay? You'd have, in many cases, up to a 20-year fallow period, if not longer. Okay? Now, traditional, this is a Swidden technology, and there's lots of other traditional methods. Okay? Okay, does everybody know what Swidden technology is? Swidden, slash and burn, where you basically would go in, you'd cut the forest down, you'd burn it, get the fertility of the burn material into the soil, then you'd farm that land for a little bit, and then you'd abandon it, let the natural forest take over again, bring the fertility back up, and then you'd come back in and cut it again. Okay? That fallow period was that period where you abandon the land. Okay? Now, this is what we're seeing today, though. Why? We need to increase more food. It's one of those three things that we talked about earlier. We need to increase more food, but because our populations are growing, we can't let these soils, at least using traditional methods, we can't let these soils sit in the fallow period as long as we did before. This was extremely sustainable. This is not. Because what's happening, as this line goes down, it's not like I'm getting the same amount of production each year during the harvest period. I mean, my soil fertility is going down. My fertility goes down, my production goes down. Does that make sense? Yep? Okay. So, huge table here, and I apologize, I highly doubt any of you guys can really read all of this. But what's important, this is out of your book, so take a look at this. But what's important here is to look at sort of two things. One is to look at, I apologize for doing this, I'm going to go back to this slide. Okay? Look at where the vast majority of the population growth is. It's basically in these three zones here. We're looking at India, other Asian, and Africa. Okay, that's where the predicted and the actual population growth is right now. Now, picking those regions out, Africa, Asia, South America, Central America, North America, Europe, Eurasia, and then the world. Looking at where those population increases are, let's look at Africa, and I'm not picking on Africa, but let's look at Africa. Okay, agricultural land, this is that top line up here. This is the amount of area of agricultural land. The next line down is the percent degraded. Okay, so of the amount of land, and this is millions of hectares, there are 187 million hectares of agricultural land in Africa. The percent degraded is 65%. Now, why is that? Overproduction and increase of yield or acreage on lands that are not necessarily suitable for that. In essence, you're seeing some combination of this and population. Okay? Yes, I know this is not a fun lecture. It's not sound great. Okay? Now, let's take a look at North America, for example. We got 236 million hectares of land. Okay, 26% of that is degraded. Now, just because it's degraded does not necessarily mean it's not productive, and just because it's degraded doesn't necessarily mean it's permanently lost. Okay? This is a slide that's basically showing the. Actually, hold on. This is not the slide I wanted here. Oh, actually, it's still here. This is the slide I wanted. Okay. If we think about what degraded means, and you saw that pie chart that I talked about, I guess about a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago. Okay. This is a different way of looking at it. Okay. This is basically what we've done is we've done a matrix. We've basically put the limitations out in a variety of different limitations: drought, mineral stress, basically salts or lack thereof, shallow depths, eroded soils, excess water or permafrost, or no serious limitations. This is the region of the world: North America, South America, all the way down to Australia, including the world. Okay? And if we look at where these stresses are, and then take a look at the countries that they're in, it gives us a fairly good picture about what some of the serious limitations, a good picture of what some of them. So these are all qualitative words that I'm using here, and I apologize that. It gives us a picture about what these countries or these regions are facing, not just due to population, but due to the environmental constraints on their land. Okay, so we were picking on Africa. Let's continue to use Africa as the example. Africa. The limitation of this stressed land, 44% is due to drought. 18% is due to mineral stress of some form. Shallow depth, 13%. Excess water, 9%. No permafrost. Basically, 16% of their soils, 16% of their soils have no serious limitations. Now, does that make you think about how they're going to be producing their food? Okay, questions? All right. Lots of tables today. If we think about population, and we think about how much land everybody actually has to grow food per person, per capita arable land, okay? Again, let's look at Africa, and we'll use North America as a comparison. Population in millions, 589 million in Africa. Now this is 1987 data, so this is pretty dated. Okay, versus North America, we're looking at 412 million. Okay? Of the area, North America has less than Africa. Africa has 2,966 million hectares. North America has 2,139. Okay? Potentially arable land, Africa has more, 433 versus 465 million hectares. Okay? Of that, cropland, 183 million hectares in Africa are cropland. While in the United States, or North America, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, 274 million hectares. Huge increase in the North American. If you look at cropland per person, 0.31 hectares per person in Africa. 0.66, almost double, a little bit more than twice in North America. Of the percentage of arable cropland, though, look at this number. 25% in Africa. 59% of the arable land in North America is being used. What does that tell you about food production? Anything? This is just so depressing.
But most of the food is being produced in the places that it's more abundant.
I think that in a sense, that makes sense. I mean, you're going to be,
I'm saying like we produce a lot of food here, but it's not needed. Whereas Africa, they have a population problem and they cannot produce food to sustain what they can eat, and they don't have money to be importing a lot of food.
They don't have money, and it turns out actually a lot of African countries are trying to go to export crops. And you'd be like, well, but you have problems with feeding your people at home now. And that's very what's the word I'm trying to think of? That's patriarchal, me telling you guys what to do. But I mean, you look at these kinds of numbers and you got to say, there's something, we've got some problems here. Because if you look at these numbers here, they definitely have a lot more arable land than we do. Now, they don't have as much if you think about it from a per capita sense. Okay, their population is this, and this number is represented, this is 1990s number. Okay, so their population is a lot larger now. Okay, yet we look at something like this, and we're sort of like, what's going on? Now, the truth is, a lot of this land, and in the United States, North America, this is the same as well. A lot of this land, just because it's arable, doesn't necessarily mean we want to turn it into agricultural land. We don't. But if you see numbers like this, it's a telling statement about the strength of agriculture in certain parts of the world. Okay, and the suitability of land for agriculture. Go.
So why is it so low? Are they using it for?
Why is it so low?
What are the factors that go into why is it 25%?
Why? Africa's always been a hard nut to crack when it comes to the Green Revolution and just development in general. And there's a lot of different reasons, and I don't probably shouldn't get into that. But a lot of it has to do with the crops. You know what? Let's get this. This is why. Okay, this was going to be my ending slide. But if we think about the factors that affect world food supply, okay, there's basically 4 of them, and they're all interlinking. And we have been talking about all these during the entire semester, but we've been talking about all of these today, actually, but not directly. Okay? The first one is the natural resources that are available, especially the soil and the water. Okay? Now, if we start thinking about what the stresses are in Africa right now, okay, just because you have the land doesn't necessarily mean, which means you have the soil, doesn't necessarily mean you have the water for that. Okay, so it could be an issue of water, and with Africa, as well as much of the world right now, water is a big limiting factor.
So the amount of arable land doesn't necessarily factor in.
Arable land does not factor in drought. Okay, and drought, and this is a good one, and most of you probably know this, but the natural disaster that actually impacts dollar-wise the most, I mean, even after Sandy and things like that, is drought. But drought is a slow, creeping disaster that people don't realize they're in it until they're in it. Does that make sense? You know, Sandy, you know when you get hit by Sandy. A drought, a good chunk of the United States right now is under drought. A large chunk of the United States. And that's just the United States. Look at the rest of the world. Africa has been under perennial droughts for years, decades. Okay? The next one is, and this is, a lot of this is green revolution, but a lot of this is other things. Technical knowledge and resources. This also applies to issues of infrastructure and management. Okay? Africa is a really good example of this. Africa, highly developed, lots of knowledge, but not necessarily pinpointed to where they need to have it done. It's not like we know more about agriculture than Africa does. And it's not like we have more resources than they do. We do have more resources, but it's a lot more than just that. Okay? If every one of the states in the United States was a different country, what do you think that would do to agriculture practices? Okay? Africa, a continent that's basically the size of North America, a little bit larger, yet you look at the number of countries and the number of types of governments and the number of resources that are in that country or in that continent, then you can suddenly understand this issue of infrastructure and management. Next one, plants and animal selection. Plant and animal selection has a huge impact upon agriculture. I mean, we can talk about the big 8. You know, there's 8 or 7, whatever it is, crops that basically are 90% of the food production in the world. Okay, and I'm more than willing to bet that almost all of you could list them. Okay, we can start with corn and we can end with sod. Okay, they account for 90% of the food production in the world. But there are, if you look at the amount of potential arable crops that are out there, there's like 13,000 or something. There's some huge, maybe 1,300 different potential arable crops. And that's not talking about animals. Okay, not that animal is going to increase that much. Okay, but we're looking at 8 crops that we basically are growing 90% of the food of the world. And that's not just food for us, but it's food for our animals, as well as food for our automobiles. And then finally, the supply of production inputs. Yes, often we associate this with fertilizer and pesticides, but fuel is a huge input into agriculture. Fuel for making pesticides and fertilizers, fuel for running our tractors, fuels for running our equipment to transport our food places, fuel for pumping water. Okay? There are resources, production inputs that make agriculture a really resource demanding industry. I mean, we think of agriculture as something sort of set aside, but agriculture is an industry. And if you look at how it's run, and we can complain about it or we can argue that there's things that are wrong with it, but it really is an industry.